Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so glad you're here. Today's webinar is called Connecting Systems Through Microsoft Power Automate. We are Spindustry, and we've been in the business for 25 plus years. And along with our SharePoint work, we provide several other services. After today's webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording and the slides that you'll see as well. If you have any questions during today's amazing webinar, you can use the questions feature and we'll answer those at the end if we've got time. My contact information will also be on the last slide of this slide deck, so if we don't get to your question, please don't hesitate to reach out. Besides today's webinar, we do have a lot of others that are free and easy to access. You can find those on spindustry.com/webinars. My name is Kelsey Culbertson, and I will be your host for today. And with me, I have Tavon Graham, who is our Senior SharePoint Developer, and I have Jared Edge, who's our Director of SharePoint Services. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Jared to let us know what we'll be talking about today.
All right, so before we jump into today's webinar, which we'll get into the agenda for in just a second here, we did want to point out that this webinar is actually a part of a series of other webinars that we've kind of been rolling with for a little bit now. So this started a few months back with a webinar that we did called SharePoint: The Next Steps, where we really just jumped in with kind of, where do we go from here? Now that we've stood up SharePoint, what should we be thinking about in order to really get the most out of the rest of our tools? And that covered some things like sensitivity, retention, and introduced the idea that really workflows and automation and some of these apps and custom experiences are really worth thinking about. Then we did our most popular webinar to date, I believe, Microsoft Teams and SharePoint working together, where we really touched on kind of how Teams is part of this overall puzzle and how we find that SharePoint and Teams are much better together. Definitely a great webinar to go back and check out if you haven't seen it. And then our last webinar we just did was Power Apps for Manufacturing, Streamlining Data Processes. I know it says for manufacturing, but really that webinar applies to everyone. We feel that there's something important about these Power Apps and the power brought to you by the Power Platform that everyone can take advantage of. So we're going to keep this series rolling today and talk a bit about Power Automate, another one of our favorite Power Platform tools.
Yep. So that brings us to a place where we now are continuing the Power Platform, and we're going to concentrate on that Power Automate piece of it. And so, as we get together and start thinking about these webinars, we put a lot of thought into what's the best way to present it, because we know that we're going to have people here that are just starting on Power Automate or the Power Platform. We also are going to have people who have dabbled in a little bit and maybe haven't had formal training in it, but they're starting to use it. And then we know we're going to have in these sessions also developers who are trying to figure out how can they get things off of their backlog? Can they use Power Automate, Power Apps, and the rest of these tools in the Power Platform to be able to do that? And the answer is yes to that always. So as we put this together, we want to make sure that we go back just a little bit and discuss what the Power Platform is, just so if you weren't at the previous webinars, you kind of get an overview of that. We'll look again at slightly, just for a couple of minutes there, about the data process, and then also about data governance as well. And then we'll jump into Power Automate, where we have lots of demos for you today. And so again, the main purpose of this webinar is to open your minds, but some of you are also going to learn here the basic steps for getting into a flow. And then some of you are going to learn here some best practices for a flow, but we're also going to give you several use cases and scenarios for using Power Automate and how it can help your organization. So that's where we're going. So I hope you guys are all going to enjoy this. I want to start it off by just saying this one phrase: I can automate that, right? And I think that's probably, if you asked a question to us saying, hey, can this be automated? We'd probably just say, I can automate that. And so we want you to kind of think the same way about your environment. It is possible to do these things. Now, some are going to be hard, some are going to be easy, but you do have this potential to be able to do all of it.
Perfect. So before we jump into Power Automate, like Jordan and Tavon have mentioned, we've done a couple webinars here recently, kind of in a series. And one thing we talk about in those is actually what's in Microsoft's Power Platform. So I would love if we could do talk about that again for any folks who might not have been to our previous ones.
Yeah, definitely. So, like you just mentioned there, Kelsey, we have talked about this before, so I'm not going to spend too long going over everything that's in the Power Platform, but I know not everyone has seen those past webinars. So the way that I want you to kind of think of the Power Platform is that Microsoft's goal was to just put power, see the name there, into the hands of you as a user to really come up with and enhance your own experience. So if any of you have worked with things like Power BI to go ahead and generate some great interactive reports, you'll have seen that it's fairly easy to use, and it can really do you a lot of favors when it comes to seeing information across different systems. When it comes to your actual working experience, well, Power Apps is there for you to actually set up a interface that can pull all your data together, let you work across different systems as well. On the subject of automation, our main topic for today, Power Automate is a great tool for you to actually take some of your day-to-day tasks and let them happen automatically for you. So you don't have to do some of those tedious things like check a spreadsheet every day to see if anything's marked for expiration. Then, for those of you who are interested in AI and the AI world we live in today, Copilot Studio is sitting out there for you to customize and enhance Copilot to talk to you the way you want it to talk to you, understand what you want it to understand, and even be able to automate some things in its own way and come up with workflows on the fly with some of those agents that are so popular these days. And then Power Pages is there for if you're interested in making external facing websites with a similar tool set.
Power Pages. All right, so let me put that in a 10,000-foot view. So let's say that you have all these third-party systems inside your environment. So you have an ERP or you have a CRM, you have Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics, or you have just a homegrown application you've built that has a database in the background that's been collecting data for a long period of time or even still collects that data like inventory, things like that. Or you've got a bunch of spreadsheets that you've been calculating and adding data to, and those are part of the picture as well. Or you're like us, where we have a lot of things sitting on SharePoint. And if you're a manufacturer, maybe you have a site for each facility sitting out there. And how do you manage all that information that comes in from all the different departments that are internal, but all the different departments that are, so that your business units and things like that, but then also the plants that you have. So having all that information out there, you kind of want all of that to work together. You want to be able to report on all that data. You want to be able to automate some processes between those different sources. You want to be able to have some intelligence in there as well, so it can go in and figure out some things for you. And you might want to just be able to present that kind of in a single pane of glass with one application to look at multiple applications, right? Which is kind of cool stuff to be able to do. Well, the Power Platform is that centerpiece. It's that piece in the middle that Microsoft has provided for us to be able to bring that experience and make it super simple for your users and for your business as a whole. So we're going to come back to that as we kind of make our way through this whole presentation. We'll kind of come back and circle around and talk about this little picture just again and see if it filled any gaps in for you.
Awesome. Okay, so one of the things that we always like to talk about in our webinars is governance. But if everyone's going to kind of start thinking about Power Automate, thinking about Power Platform, we should probably talk about, data process and their data governance.
Awesome.
Right. I think that's a great idea. So before we begin really showing you what's possible with Power Automate or these other Power Platform tools, I think it's a good idea to just center your mind on yourself and your organization. You currently have processes. You have things that happen. You do things as an organization. And Power Platform really wants to make those easier for you. So let's think about this from several perspectives. How about our HR folks out there? You have things that go on like onboarding. There's lots of little steps involved in onboarding, lots of people to notify, lots of things to make sure are getting done on time and things are getting signed and everybody has the access they need to whatever it might be. Again, there's just a lot going on there. Wouldn't it be nice if that experience could be a little bit easier for you?
Yeah, and so HR has tons of stuff sitting out there, and an HR office is usually the least amount of people that is serving the most amount of people as well. So anything we can do to shorten some of the processes or automate some of the processes for an HR department, that's good, right? Saving people time and making sure all the steps get done, right? And then you have finance processes as well. So you might have invoicing that you're tracking, things like that, that could actually be automated. But we do a lot of things like contract management as well. So we've seen this over and over. Someone says, hey, how can I better manage my contracts without buying a $500,000 contract management system? Is there something that I would do just for simple things? And yes, that's something that SharePoint, Office 365, Power Automate, all these tools that you're already paying for, they can help you do these particular things. You'll see as we go through this, the ones that are in bold are ones that we get common requests for. Okay, Tavon, tell us about like front office operations.
Yeah. One of the more common things we see come up with front office is things like standard operating procedures or just policies, right? How do we easily make sure and keep track of the fact that people have seen, acknowledged, and understand our policies? Or how do we even do some change management with those policies? Make sure the right people have seen them, signed off on them, approved them, edited them before we ever show that new revision to the rest of the company. Well, again, that's one of those places where there's a lot of tedious steps involved there, and these powerful Power Platform tools can really help make that go a little bit smoother for you.
Awesome. So what about facilities and plant operations, things like that?
I think what I'll focus on with facility and plant operations is inspections, right? We all know that if we've got buildings sitting out there, we've got plants, we've got even vehicles or other assets that need to be maintained, inspection is one of the more important things that can actually go on so we can make sure that everything is in working order. Well, in our last webinar, we demoed how Power Apps can actually make that process go a lot smoother for you very, very quickly and very easily. But did you know that that app we demoed last time actually has workflows behind it? And I know not everyone was here to see that app, so we're going to show that to you again today and kind of connect the dots there with workflows.
Awesome. And then for sales departments as well, like doing that sales follow up, automating the process that makes sure that those things happen, especially if you don't have one of those third party sales tools out there, just being able to have a simple process that says, hey, I need to do a follow up. I need to do another follow up. I need to do another follow up. Or if you are an organization that creates things, so you have a lot of products that you create, but you don't actually do the selling of them, you ship those out to dealers to be able to ship that out. Imagine enhancing the process of dealer communication or dealer engaging with those dealers, like keeping your products front of mind for them, being able to automate some of that so that that's happening and taking the burden off of either salespeople or the back office salespeople, to be able to do all those different things. I think that's super important. So not only do you have processes, but you also need to interact and engage with your workers as well, with your employees. And so that might be in the form of, hey, I need to get alerts when certain things happen, or I need to alert people when certain things happen as well. So those are things that could be automated. So start thinking in that frame of mind. And Tavon, tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, another major piece of this whole puzzle is actually just gathering information. Think about your current processes. Again, do you have things like paper forms sitting out there that don't always get filled out correctly? Do you have things like even Microsoft Forms where it'd be nice if we could do a little bit of a better job enforcing rules and standardizing how certain fields get filled in and doing some calculations on the form? Well, this Power Platform can help us meet some of those needs with just our forms, with getting images into the system, with, again, inspections. We think that this is going to be a great tool set for you to really customize and enhance your own experience. And again, it's tools that you already have sitting there.
Yep. And we can't do a webinar without talking about Copilot AI. So, I mean, just imagine adding that intelligence piece into everything that you're doing. So, yeah, someone filled out a form and it submitted some stuff, but let's have the AI make some determinations in there as to what should happen after that thing is submitted. Like, hey, does it feel this is really, really, really important? Is there something that someone said in there that should be able to evaluate to be able to make some decisions off? All that's important. But not only can AI help us with those like summaries and getting answers and making some decisions in the midst of a workflow, it also can help us build workflow or help build processes and help us build apps and things like that as well. So AI is a huge portion of this as you guys continue your AI journey going down the road. So not only that, we also know that you have data in lots of places, like we talked about earlier. So you've got some out in Salesforce, some out in Dynamics, or you got it in an Oracle database or Excel documents all over the place. And so Tavon, let's just talk about this for just a second.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier the idea of this one single pane of glass. And I think when we start to think about the different systems and different places where we have data, the need for that single pane of glass really starts to show up, right? I don't want my finance people to have to go out to 10 different apps and tools and try to make sure that all the information is up to date and synced across them. I want them to go to one place where, sure, we may need that data in different systems, but can it get there automatically? I don't want my IT people to have to go to 100 different ticketing systems if every facility that we have uses a different method of submitting tickets. I want to pull things together, and I think that's really important for people.
Yep. So I totally agree with you. And we have a bunch of examples kind of on here. We won't read them all to you for the interest of time. But, if you have an HRIS system, can it tie into other things? Absolutely. If you have Salesforce or Dynamics or any of those types of things out there, can it tie into other systems? Absolutely. So you start to think, where does this system start to drop off? And what are some other things that I want to do that this system can't provide for me? Those are the places where Power Automate, Power Apps, Power BI, Microsoft Copilot Studio, all those things come together to help us pick up where those other applications leave off. And I want to just say this one thing. I don't have to have a process that works from, let's say, Salesforce to SharePoint, or from, my Monday.com to SharePoint. SharePoint doesn't even have to be a piece of that picture, because I know you guys hear us talk about SharePoint all the time, and some of you are here because you have SharePoint. But really, realistically, is it can work with any system. So it could be a process that goes from Salesforce to Oracle, right? Or from Monday to your HRIS system, or whatever it is. So it can bridge the gaps between other systems, and they don't have to be Microsoft systems that you're actually paying attention to. So that's important as well. So Tavon, sum that all up for us.
All right. So what we're starting to kind of paint the picture of here is that, we have this vast world of data and different tools and different systems and different processes and ways that our people work. We want to bring all of that together under one roof. And that's the goal of the Power Platform, right? So if you've worked with Power BI, you might be aware that it can pull data and show you reports based on various different systems, no matter where that data happens to live, if we just build the connection to it. Power Apps, like we talked about last time, right? It can pull all of this data together for us from various different databases, different systems, into that single pane of glass where I just have the one app that I go to. Maybe it's on my phone, maybe it's on my PC, wherever we want that app to work. And I can bring that with me and just see everything I need to see from the one place. Again, Copilot Studio is an incredible tool for customizing your AI experience and making it so that, when we want to talk to an IT specialist chatbot that learned off of our own IT specialist documents, we can do that. Or we want to have it answer questions or ask questions intelligently about our data, we can really set the scope for it. So it's not just the generic Copilot experience. And then my favorite of these tools, Power Automate. Again, I want you to think of your own processes, your own day-to-day work. What would make that just a little bit easier for you? What would make your life that little bit better? And so often you're going to find that it comes in the form of automation, and that Power Automate is a great home for that. And
Yep.
then there's Power Pages.
Yeah. So again, just putting that all back into the picture, that middle piece there, that's the Power Platform really helping you bring all those pieces together for all your business systems as well. So use them by themselves, use them all together. It all works out. Okay, so let's turn it back over to Kelsey for a second.
Perfect. Okay, so now that we've kind of laid the groundwork there, we've talked about Power Platforms, we talked about data process, data governance. Let's jump into what everyone's really here for. What is Microsoft Power Automate?
Excellent question. So I think the simple way that Microsoft would want you to think about what Power Automate is it's just kind of a suite of tools designed to help non-developers build their own business workflows and automate processes. But really, from kind of a layman's perspective or someone who's not super familiar with it, the best way to think about Power Automate is that it is a very visual tool anyone out there can use to, again, make their lives that little bit easier. It's all about creating custom workflows with a nice drag and drop visual click, and this is what you get type of interface so that it's easy for those of you who are developers to use, those of you who have never thought about code or thought about a workflow or automation before to use, and for those of you who are kind of in the middle ground, you'll get something out of this tool as well.
And I think it's just also worth mentioning that you might hear it referred to as different things. So someone might just say workflow. Well, in the Office 365 environment, they're talking about Power Automate. And then they might say, well, we're going to automate processes. Well, again, they're referring to doing that with Power Automate. Or they might say, hey, I'm going to create a flow for that, or or they might even say Microsoft Flow because that was the previous name of Power Automate. So if you hear those terms, again, they're all referring to the same thing. It's just Power Automate.
And then what about some of those key features of Power Automate? So again, just stretch your mind. We want to talk about some of these real selling points to Power Automate over some other automation tools that might be out there. Again, one of them to definitely keep in mind is that you are already paying for some Power Automate capacity, so that's always a big plus. But we've also got AI in this picture, right? So again, we live in this AI world now where we can't get away from AI. It's infused into everything that we ever think about, and Power Automate is no different. There is an AI centric or AI first development approach you can take to building your own workflows. We can say, hey, Copilot, I need a workflow to do this. I need a workflow to send a notification when something gets added to a SharePoint list. Or I need a workflow that'll help me create a task when I click a button in Teams. Great. Copilot can help get you started down that road. Now, I'm not going to overpromise here and say that it's going to be perfect or that I would even think that everyone should be using Copilot as that first step in creating your workflows. But for those of you who really like building with AI, just know that it's part of the platform. And it goes beyond just building your apps as well, right? Copilot and other AI can actually have a role in your workflows and in your process. So one of the demos that we're going to show you today actually leverages AI to pick up on whether or not an inspection was a bad thing and we need to create a task and get someone out there right now, or whether it was actually a good thing and everything was in order and there's no need for us to send someone out to a facility. So AI can definitely play a role in your existing processes, not just help you create new workflows.
And then
And then
Timon, what
for
about
the
for what about for developers? Like, so, those things you mentioned so far really, really benefit those people who are just beginning and then also have had some experience in it. But I know we have some developers here too. So talk about this solution packages here for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the great things that Microsoft would always encourage you to do when you're working with the Power Platform is to use this dev test prod approach to creating your workflows and your apps. Now I know not everyone's familiar with that terminology, but let me break that down a little bit. What that really means is we want to keep the in development, not ready for people to work with it, not ready for it to roll out, workflows and apps separate from those that we're doing testing on. And those should be separate from those that are actually live, sitting out there interacting with our users and doing stuff in the real world. That way we can start something out in that dev environment, just kind of a sandbox to build and tinker. Then once we think it's good, we can move that over to test and actually start doing some tests up against it, make sure that it's going to work out and that we have all of our bases covered. And then once it's approved there, we can move it into what we call prod or production, where all of our users, or at least approved users, can actually interact with it. And the
Awesome.
Power Platform has this idea of solution packages and multiple environments to help us accomplish that goal.
Awesome. So then tell us then, if we have that, that means the company is probably leaned towards governance. They're trying to govern the production of these flows and such for some of the more complicated things that are going to serve a full business need, right? Maybe not an individual workflow that where Jared just wants to be notified when a new document is added to a library. But for some of the more serious things that we're doing inside of there. So if they're going to do that, then they probably need to also manage some of the flows that are being created as well. Talk about some of that little governance piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing to just make sure that we're all aware of is that you don't have to see Power Automate or the Power Platform in the way that Microsoft does, where they think anyone should be able to use it. You, as an organization, can decide, should everyone be able to make workflows? Is it a select audience? Is it just IT? Wherever you fall on that spectrum, the Power Platform can meet you there. You also have control over what people are allowed to do in their workflows, what actions they're allowed to use, what connections they can work with. So there's some great governance tools out there for the kind of admins in the audience here to definitely familiarize yourselves with.
Awesome. All right. So I know we want to talk about connectors, but I think before we actually go dive into that connectors piece, if we could just talk about the pieces of a flow so that when we're doing our demos, everyone understands kind of what they're seeing in there. Let's start there.
Yeah, great idea. So the very first thing we're going to talk about here is actually the very first piece of any workflow in Power Automate, and that is called a trigger. Triggers are really just there to help the workflow figure out when it's supposed to run. Now, these triggers come in three different flavors or varieties. One of those is called automated cloud flows. One of them is called instant cloud flows, and the last one is scheduled cloud flows. Automated flows are really just waiting for something to happen that they can respond to or that they can take further action on. For example, an email arrived in your inbox. You got invited to an event on your Outlook calendar. Someone submitted a Microsoft form. Someone created an item in SharePoint. We don't click any button to tell the workflow to run, it just responds to the fact that it should be happening.
Awesome.
Instant cloud flows, on the other hand, we do click a button or we do explicitly tell the workflow, I need you to run right now. You're going to see this come into play with things like Power Apps or clicking a button on a Teams message to run a workflow or clicking a button on a SharePoint item to run a workflow. And then finally, the scheduled flows. Like the name suggests, these just run on a schedule. Maybe you want it to run every 10 minutes. Maybe you want it to run every hour, every week on Tuesday and Thursday, every month on the third day of the month. Whatever your schedule is, this workflow trigger will allow for it.
And so, Tavon, are you saying that once I have a flow and I'm getting ready to work on it, what determines whether it's an automated flow or an instant flow or a scheduled flow is really which trigger you actually put in that workflow? Is that what we're saying?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Okay. And we're going to do a demo of that in just a little while. Okay. Perfect.
All right. So if triggers are the piece that tell the workflow to run, actions are the piece that actually does something. They're the rest of the flow really will be made up of actions. So these actions are kind of split up by connectors, and we'll talk about connectors in a minute here. But you can see some of these are actually talking to things like OneDrive. Some of them are talking to things like Planner, SharePoint, and even some of those other services. Actions are how we do things like make a file, send an email, calculate a date, hold on to values and variables. All the pieces of the actual logic that your workflow needs to do are considered an action.
Nice. All right. So then with that, now let's talk about connectors.
All right. So connectors, I'm going to keep this on a very simple level. If you want to know about connectors technically and under the hood, you can certainly look at Microsoft's documentation. They've got a great breakdown on it. But very simply put, connectors are the way that Power Automate or Power Apps or the rest of the suite is able to talk to different systems. Here we've got a couple of screenshots from the very top of the list of connectors, and you can see that we barely scrolled anywhere, and there's plenty of them listed here. So with these connectors, we can do things like talk to AI Builder from a workflow. We can talk to MSN Weather from a workflow. We can talk to Planner, to SharePoint, or again, even some of those third-party systems. Like you'll see on the left here, we have Adobe Acrobat Sign. That's pretty impressive. We've got Amazon S3 for those of you storing data out there. We've got plenty of connectors for all of the different apps and systems that you might be using.
And I think it's important, because you said it, but I think maybe we should draw it out. If all of these companies are creating connectors for this platform, that says something, right? It says that this is not just a by the way we have this in our environment thing. It's saying they recognize how powerful it is and they want you to be able to interact with their environment. So they just created a connector for it. And then Tavon, tell me what happens if I'm looking through, I have this third party app that I use, but I can't find a connector in here that was created by that third party app. Then what?
Great question. So that's where what we call custom connectors come in, where as long as that other system has an API, we can build our own connector and we can talk to that system just like any other tool we wanted to interact with.
Awesome. So you just basically said, I can connect to anything, anywhere, and make a flow or a Power App that talks to those systems. As long as they have an API, we're good to go.
Absolutely.
All right. That is amazing. And I don't know if everybody else found that to be powerful, but that is absolutely powerful. All right. Give us an overview of where we're going.
All right. So this slide here kind of introduces you to the demos that we're going to be walking through today. So over on the far left, you'll see a screenshot of that Power App we demoed in our last webinar. I'm going to take you through that app one more time and actually point out to you where workflows are involved. We'll be able to see the makeup of some of those workflows as we go as well. We're going to look at a workflow where we, again, leverage AI Builder to actually have AI respond to that incoming inspection report. It's going to help us figure out, was this report a good thing or did something go wrong and someone needs to get out there and fix it? For the HR folks out there, we're going to take a look at a real-world scenario involving a FMLA process and how we were able to transform that from a very manual, very classic traditional process to something that's automated and leverages not just what SharePoint can do, but also Power Automate.
Awesome. And so I'll say down at the bottom, if you're interested in like some step-by-step information that we've done before on Power Automate, we have some links to the old webinars. You guys will get this presentation as well. It's in there. But if you want to see how this facilities app was done, we actually start with that in the last webinar that we did for Power Apps, and then we continue that here, and then you'll probably see us do a little bit more in that app as we go forward. So if you're kind of interested in a facilities maintenance app, you can look at this one and see what we did for ours. All right, fantastic. Excellent.
Beautiful. Okay, so now I think everyone would really love to see the benefits of using Power Automate and my favorite part, some demos.
All right. So these demos are meant to show you the possibilities that are out there. Okay. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to open your mind. And again, I know some of you are just beginning, some of you are in the middle, and some of you are developers. But there's a little bit here for all of you. So I'm going to do a demo in the HR portion of this on FMLA, and that's kind of very simple. So it's kind of for our beginners and kind of what you could do there. And I'll show you some beginning steps as well. And then Tavon's going to take over and kind of show us some demos on the inspections app and how we got to where we are. But within this, you will see an instant flow, an automated flow. You'll see some use of AI in there, and you'll see a scheduled flow as well. So that's what you should expect from us. Let's see if we can get you there right now. So let me get out of these slides. All right. So here's our Spin Manufacturing site, which is just totally awesome. The best SharePoint site you've ever seen in your life. It's all green and everything. We've got departments just like any other company would have. And I'm going to go over to the Human Resources Department. And my Human Resources Department has a top-level site that they use that people can come in and gather information and they can push information out to them. But they also have a private site where they do their sensitive work that no one else should be able to get to. And in this site, they talk about FMLA all the time. They talk about benefit resources. They talk about safety investigations and like 200 other things. But these are things they feel should be front of mind all the time that they have to work with a lot. And so before I go into that FMLA library, I'm going to talk to you about the process and how we got here, because oftentimes someone might ask me, well, how do I get from the mentality that I'm using right now, which is a folder-based mentality, how do I get from that over into a place where I truly am doing some really cool stuff and being able to automate? And this is not saying that you need to stop using folders. Please don't think that I'm saying that. Just know that we think that if you can find locations where you're not using folders and you start using metadata, you will enhance your system. You will be able to do a lot more. So listen to this as I kind of take you from the old process to the new process. So in the old process, we had for their FMLA, they get FMLA cases in, and they come in as a document, and this kind of got this little encoded name in it, so that if someone accidentally saw this screenshot of it or whatever, or if I was sharing my screen, they wouldn't know who had FMLA. These folders up here are our case managers. We have 4 case managers: Aiden, Jared, Pam, and Patty. And what we do is we meet about this. So the HR department meets about this and says, let's assign that to Patty. So they grab this document and drag it up into Patty's folder. Then they take out their typewriter, boom, and type a big old email message. And they send that over to Patty saying, you've been assigned a case. Here's a link back to the document. And they break permissions and all that kind of stuff here. And then they also type up an email to the person that the FMLA is about. and let them know that their case has been assigned and that Patty's going to contact and reach out to them and contact them. So that's a process, all manual, right? And so we said, hey, if we move that into SharePoint, we could make this a little bit better process. So instead of using those folders, we basically added some metadata columns in here, and we even enhanced it because there were things that they had to keep checking on that we just put right here in the metadata, like the review date, right, or the status of it. Is it open or is it closed? Is it active or is it not started? And then here, who's it assigned to, right? So let me take you over to that library and show you how we took that and then allowed us to do a nice workflow with it as well. So let's just talk about it. So here's my library. So the first thing you'll see is that I have this metadata here, who's it assigned to. So if it's not assigned, that's one of the things we're going to continue to talk about and decide who that needs to be assigned to, and you'll see me assign that in just a second. But we also have like a review date, and this is giving us a nice, just little color-coded thing. This is all out of the box SharePoint, right? That's giving me a little color-coded thing that says, hey, this review date is passed. That means there should be another review date that's posted. Like, when are we getting back with this person again? And it's not an emergency. It's just a nice little feature that allows us to know we are contacting people and we are working with them. And then you see the status over here. But just having that allows me to, at a glance, be able to do things like, oh, let me group this by status, right? Or let me group this by the assigned to, and that kind of looks like folders. These unassigned ones are the ones that we're still talking about, and we're going to assign to somebody, and then these are ones that have been assigned that gives me a little summary. So some of you knew that, some of you didn't, but now let's see where the workflow part kicks in, right? So they have their little meeting, and they come in and say, oh, we're going to assign this to who it needs to be assigned to. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on this and just show you the properties of it in the longest way possible, because it's the biggest way possible. So I'm sitting in here, and I see the names of the documents, I see the review date, which can be set by someone, and I see the assigned to. I also see the employee this is for. So who's this FMLA about? Jason Plunkett. And so that way my workflow knows who to send that email to. So all they're going to do is come in here and say, hey, we decided we're going to assign this to Patty. Okay, so we go ahead and type in Patty, we click the button here, and then we can go ahead and hit save, right? And again, I did that in the longest way possible because that's the biggest way that you could see. It's the largest font way so that you could see it. So now Patty has 3 assigned to her. That's all good. So I created a workflow in the background. Now let me show you how I did that, and then I'll show you the actual workflow. So I wanted to make sure you guys knew how to get to all this stuff. So here I'm in my site. I'm going to go to my waffle here. We call that the waffle for those who don't know that. And inside of here, I'll see Power Automate. If you don't see Power Automate, you can click on More Apps and you'll find it inside of there. Or you could just type it up here and it'll actually find it for you. So here I'm going to go ahead and click on Power Automate, and it's going to take me over to show you kind of the similar to the screenshot that we had earlier. If I click on Create, you'll see this is where we got that screenshot from. So I see inside of here the automated flow, the instant flow, the scheduled flow. I also see over here like the desktop flow and process mining, which we're not talking about today, and then the describe it to design it, right? Using the AI to help you out there, which is really cool, right? Down the bottom, you'll see several templates. I'm not a template type person. I actually like to create my flows from scratch, but that's because I know how. But you might say, well, I need to do something with Monday.com. Type in Monday.com down here, and you'll probably find some templates that are associated with their stuff. Or Salesforce, type in Salesforce. You see some templates that are there for you. So I'm going to click here on automated flow. And again, I don't like to, you can actually say, here's what I want my trigger to be. I don't like going through here. I just like to do it all at one time and see it in the designer. So I'm just going to click skip, and it'll take me over to where I need to be. And so when I did that, it gave me the option to use the new designer. And I personally prefer the old designer because I don't have enough confidence in the new designer yet. There's some things that I don't necessarily like about it yet, but you know what? They improve these things every day. And if you know us at all, we don't tell you not to use a certain thing. What we tell you is when we have that full confidence in it, we'll come to you and say, hey, you know what? You can definitely start using this now. All those little tweak things that we saw in there, they're all perfect now, and you'll be able to start using it. But for right now, we can't really say that to you. So we're going to switch over to the old designer. And then inside of here, you'll truly be able to see what we mean by triggers and actions and all those things. And so in here, I would go pick out the trigger that I want. And let's just say that I was working with Power Virtual Agents, or I was working with Microsoft Dataverse, or I was working with Microsoft Teams. I would click on that, and it'll show me all the triggers that are available. Like, hey, for a selected message, or when a new channel gets added, things like that. So it just shows me what I want to see. I click on those things, and then I do all the stuff that it asks me to do. And it's really a lot of point and click. now it's saying, hey, which team do you want to work with? And I go pick out a team, and then I go in and I add actions after that. So those are just the steps that you get in to do it. But let me show you my workflow. Okay, so I'm going to go jump out here to my workflows. Yep, I know. Okay, and I have this one workflow here, which is my FMLA notification. So let's go back to my scenario here, where they have assigned a user or a case manager, and then the workflow behind the scene kicks off. Why does it kick off? Because I'm using an automated flow that's monitoring that list. So it says when an item or file is modified, and you'll see that I've told it which site to go to, my private site, and which library to look at, which is my FMLA library, right? There's a lot more I could do in here to get a little bit more advanced, but that was the minimum I needed to give it. Then, thanks to Tavon, he said, hey, well, every time someone signs that, every time someone makes a change on that document or changes even the status of that document, you don't want this flow to run all the way through it and send out another email. So you should have this get changes step inside of here. So I put that in here that goes and looks at the actual change I'm looking for. And so you'll see here that I have the ID of the item that was being changed. I also have this, these are the keys to make this work. So I have the trigger window start token and the trigger window end token for anybody who really wanted to know how to do that. That's a little bit more technical, right? But I have that in there. And from there, it allowed me to do all the things that I wanted to do. So here I have a condition where I'm saying if the column that I'm interested in, which is the assigned to column, is equal to true, like was that the one that got changed? Yes, it was. Then I'm going to go ahead and do some stuff. Otherwise, I'm just going to stop the workflow because they changed some other column. I'm not even interested in those things. So I'm going to stop right at that point. And this is the terminate. Tavon's going to mention that as a best practice later, but now you've actually seen it. So I could have all these other steps sitting inside this if statement, and maybe that's a good idea, but that's okay. It's still going to work out for me. So another best practice that I'm using here is I'm tracking variables, okay? And these variables come in handy for me. So I said, well, out of that item that was changed, like who's the employee that I need to email? So I got their email address out of there. And now it's just a variable called employee email. You'll see me use that in a second. And then down here, I have the case manager's email as well. And I just went and got the assigned to email. So who was it assigned to? Like Patty, right? So I have all that trapped in there. Then my workflow is going to send out those two essential emails. One goes to the employee. So I've got the employee's email plugged in here. I've got their display name, so I can say John Smith inside of there. I've got their the assigned Smith down here, or the case manager, sorry, the case manager's name down here. So Patty Simmons. I've got some other information down here, like how they can contact them. But the email itself is pre-written, and it's always going to be the same. So I don't have to type it up every time. It's already got the template. It's already ready, set to go. And you can also add some additional features to that as well. Some of the advanced features, like maybe you want a BCC in there or something like that. And then down here, I have the email that goes to the case manager, which I even have a full link back to get to the document, so they can just click here and see the document. So let's see how that turned out. I actually had a couple of flows run already, and I had the one that I just ran a couple of seconds ago. It took 3 seconds. 4 minutes ago is when I did it. It took 3 seconds to run. I'm going to go look at the run itself, which is nice to be able to do, to be able to see what happened, especially if you get errors in there. Being able to track your errors in here is really nice. And you'll see that it went through all the steps. It actually filled out all the information. This is just some of the technical stuff in the background. Let me show you the actual emails that got sent. So here, let's just refresh this. Make sure I got some emails. So I have some emails from earlier. This is what you would see. So if I had signed myself instead of Patty to that, I would have gotten an email that says, hey, dear Jason Plunkett, here's all your stuff, and it plugged in all the names. Like here's my name because I'm the case manager. Here's my email address because I'm the case manager, my phone number, all that stuff's in there. And then the other email was for the case manager. There you go, which gives them that link to be able to click here and actually go out to that actual document. So the workflow is now doing all that. And you know what we solved? If the person who normally sends out those emails is not here, those jobs don't get done. Now it does, because the workflow does that. And the workflow works how many days a year? All of them. How many hours a day? All of them. How much more are we paying it? Nothing, because we're already paying for Office 365 anyway. That's really cool stuff. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tavon to kind of give us some more in-depth scenarios that we have.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to start us off by just running through this inspections app that we kind of built and demoed in our last webinar. Again, we're not going to spend too long on it, but it's important for the context for some of these workflows. So Spin Manufacturing here, as a company, they have various different facilities that they need to regularly or spontaneously, depending on how things are going, submit inspection reports on. They've got HQ, they've got the Clinton plant, the Phoenix facility, so on and so forth. They've got all of that currently trapped here in SharePoint. In another SharePoint list, they have the actual contacts for those facilities. So here I am one of the contacts for HQ. I'm primarily responsible for windows, conveyor belts, and the paint. And I am actually marked as the emergency contact. So if something's going really wrong, I should be the one we reach out to instead of Kinsey. If it's a door, a vehicle, or paint issue that's not emergency, then we should reach out to Kinsey. Same story with the rest of these contacts. You'll see they all are marked with the facility they represent, whether they're the emergency, and what their actual areas of responsibility are. Then we're also tracking the pictures that might come in from some of these actual inspections that get done, right? If I go out to HQ and I find a broken window, well, I'm going to take a picture of that and I need to submit that back to the facilities team so that they actually know what they're looking for and what they're working with. We've also, of course, got an actual list out of the inspection reports. So for each report that gets submitted, we log it here into this list. It gets a nice pre-generated title, the inspection date, comments, and some other information kind of tagged onto it. Wow, that's a lot of lists to have to potentially interact with just to make sure that I submit my inspection report correctly. And to have to jump back and forth between inspection photos and inspection reports. I don't want to do any of that, right? This is one of those places where a single pane of glass approach, where we put this all together into one interface, we think is really going to help Spin Manufacturing. So that's where this Power App that we created for Spin Manufacturing really comes into play. So you'll find that all of those lists that I just mentioned are represented and are involved in this Power App. So over here, the list of facilities that we have, well, that's represented, right? I see HQ, I see the Clinton plant, I see the location and addresses for each of these. If I click on one of these, I'll be able to see the inspections that have been submitted for that plant. I can see who the contacts are. And very importantly, I can actually submit a new inspection report as well. So let's say that we're submitting an inspection report here for Seattle. All right, it's already got a few of these pieces of information filled in for me, like it was kind enough to generate the title, like it set the inspection date to today. But what if I was to say, we found some broken windows? We found broken windows at the plant. And no, this wasn't really a planned inspection. I just saw it and felt like I needed to let the facilities team know about it. The items that I looked at here, it was the windows. I didn't really look at the doors, paint, or vehicles. And I'm going to say, yeah, it's probably an emergency. It's getting pretty cold out these days. We need this fixed right away. Then, of course, just to help out the facilities team, I'll attach myself a little photo here of the actual broken window that we have. And I can see that uploaded successfully. All right, great. So this inspection report is just about ready for me to submit. So now as a user, all I do is click the submit button. And what that's going to do is it's going to kick all this information over to SharePoint, and it's going to let me know that my inspection report was submitted successfully. Very nice, easy to use interface for the people actually submitting these reports or who need to come back through later. Click on one of these past reports and actually see what was filled in, see the photos that were attached. Awesome app, very easy to use, and we set that up quickly for Spin Manufacturing. But did you know that there are actually workflows involved in this app? So when I clicked that submit button, what it did was, like I said, it kicked that report over here to my inspection reports list. But it did that using a Power Automate workflow. Let me actually show that workflow to you here. All right, so I've got this workflow here called Submit Inspection Report. And this is one of those instant style workflows that I mentioned. You can tell because it's using the Power Apps V2 trigger, which just means that my app said, hey, workflow, it's time for you to run. It's time to go out and do something. So what this app goes ahead and does is it actually gets the current weather for us. So say that we submitted this report for HQ, it's going to go ahead and get the weather here in Des Moines and actually attach that information to the inspection report. And that's going to be important for facilities to be aware of.
So Tavon,
Then it
is there a
does.
lot of stuff in all of these little pieces, or is it just like I have one thing to fill in there, or is it's a lot of stuff? Tell me about that too as you're going through.
Sure. So for for the create item, there's actually a fair amount of information that we're filling in, and we're passing all of this coming from the app over into SharePoint. So you can see all those columns that I had on my inspection reports list. They're listed out here, and I'm filling them in either with information directly from the app, like the title of the report or the inspection date, from another action in the workflow, like weather we're filling in based on that get weather action that we used, or even just putting some regular raw text in there. Like here in the weather again, I'm actually combining values. So I'm doing the current weather conditions. I add a hyphen, the current temperature, and then I say the word degrees. And then last but
Awesome.
not least, we respond back to the app and we pass back some information so it can actually show us that little success message. All right, so this is a workflow that is definitely helpful for that inspection app. But I want to show you where the process continues from there. Because you might have seen over here in SharePoint, I have another link for facilities work tasks. And we talked a second ago about how somebody might need to get out there and actually do something about those broken windows. So here in facilities work tasks, we created another item. Its title is the facility that it relates to. It's got a link back to the inspection report. Notice that this one that I just submitted was actually already assigned to Kinsey. This was handled by a second workflow. And I think that's important for you to start thinking about is not everything has to be done inside of one workflow. So we saw just a second ago, I have that instant workflow that ties into the Power App, but I have an automated or an automatic workflow that picks up where it kind of left off called create maintenance task. What you'll find is here I've got a trigger for when an item is created over in SharePoint. So I targeted this at that inspection reports list over on our inspection site just to say, hey, anytime that we get a new inspection report in, go ahead and run this flow. Now you might see these three kind of orangish, brownish boxes called try, catch, and finally, and you might be wondering what that's about. This is one of those good practices that we like to recommend, using what Power Automate refers to as scopes, where we're able to group actions together into a block known as try, catch, finally, or any other names that you want to apply to your scopes. For those of you who are developers out there in the audience, you're probably pretty familiar with the idea of try catch. But for those of you who aren't developers, what this really means is the try block just holds actions that we want to run and just the general flow logic. The catch block holds on to what we're going to do in case something goes wrong. And if we have finally, it's stuff that should happen no matter what, no matter whether the flow was a success or if something went wrong. In this case, I don't have anything in finally. I just have it here as a placeholder. And in my catch, I'm just sending an email to myself to say, hey, that task didn't really get created correctly.
So this is a good point because what you're doing there is, because the question might be, well, why have the finally on there if you don't have anything in it? But what you're doing is you're saying, I have a template for this, and I should always use the same template to make sure that I'm meeting some governed rules that I have.
Exactly. And that's another great practice that we're going to talk more about in a few minutes is, hey, templates are actually a pretty powerful thing if you create them for your organization. All right. So we also mentioned that we were going to show you an AI-infused workflow. Well, that is this workflow. So you might see this cute little brain icon here. That tells us that this connector or this action is really talking to the AI builder. Excuse me, that's associated with the Power Platform. So here we've got an action that just analyzes positive or negative sentiment in text. But I went ahead and renamed that to say analyze positive or negative sentiment in ticket description. And then I go ahead and pass in the inspection comments as what it's going to be analyzing for me. So why is this useful here? What we're really doing, if I expand this little condition here, is we say, okay, if that inspection comment or the description of the inspection, the AI thought it was negative, we probably need to assign a task, get someone out there to fix something. If it thought it was positive, we can just go ahead and move on and end the flow run. Otherwise, if it was an emergency and somebody said, yep, this is an absolute emergency, get someone out here, we don't want to leave that up to the AI. We had a user tell us someone needs to be out here as soon as possible. So we go ahead and create the task for them anyway. Then what all this workflow does is it just gets the contact for the facility, and then it goes ahead and creates and assigns a task to that contact. So for sake of time, I'm not going to dive too deeply into this, but you'll notice here that I'm using a couple of other advanced flow techniques, like I'm using a filter query to only pull back the contact for that specific facility that this workflow run related to. And down here in my create and assign task, I'm using what we call expressions to do some calculations to come up with the current date or get the future time, or only actually use one of those values that might get contact pulled back, just in case it pulled back multiple. Now, all of those advanced things I just mentioned, I'm doing the advanced way, but you as a user who's just getting started could do something similar. Instead of using a filter query, you could have a condition, another one of these types of actions that just check something, and use that to decide if you're looking at the right contact. I just built this flow in a way that's a little bit more efficient. So again, as a user who's just starting out or that citizen developer, you can certainly accomplish something just like this. It just might look different. It might run a little bit slower if you're not familiar with some of those workflow best practices. All right, and then one more piece of the puzzle I want to introduce to you is the scheduled flow. So here I've got a workflow that runs every day at 8 o'clock Central Time. And what this workflow does is it uses another one of those error handling templates. This one's a little more advanced, a little more built out, just to show you how there can be more involved there. But it goes ahead and it gets all of the overdue tasks in that maintenance tasks list that we just looked at, the facilities work tasks list. It's again using a filter query, but note that I left us a little note here to help explain this action. Sure, we can rename it to say get all overdue tasks, and that's a helpful place to start. But I like to leave notes on my actions as well to really get more specific about what it's doing and how it's doing it. So here I'm telling whoever looks at this workflow in the future that this action gets all tasks from this list that aren't marked as completed and are overdue or have a due date in the past. Then for each of those items that it pulls back, it goes ahead and it builds a nice little link that we can include in this email that we send to the task owner. And the reason we're building this link is HTML links work best in these Outlook actions. Again, one of those little good practices that you'll get more and more familiar with over time. But here you can see how each type of flow can be involved in one overall process. From the app, we have our instant flow that just runs whenever someone submits one of these reports. Where that leaves off, doing a very specific job of creating that report in our list, our automatic flow kicks in and says, okay, do I need to take this further? Do I need to create a task? And then our daily recurring flow over here is that next logical step where it makes sure that we're on track with actually completing our tasks. So even in one single overall process, all three of these different flow types are a pretty impactful and pretty meaningful thing. Anything you wanted to add to that before we jump back over to our slides?
Nope, that was awesome. I know we're running a little bit low on time, but we are going to keep going until we get finished. And then if there's questions, we'll also answer those questions as well. So great. So what you've seen so far is all these demos, and you've seen a simple flow, you've seen instant flow, an automated flow, and a scheduled flow. Let's kind of see how some of that. Let's talk a little bit more about how that fits into the bigger puzzle, and then we'll just kind of start summing up here. So again, taking this picture, hopefully what we want you to be able to see is now I'm recognizing that I do have these multiple systems out there or processes that span across multiple things. And I want you, we hope that you're able now to start seeing that I can start tying those things together with Power Apps, Power Automate, and that's what you've seen us do in the last two things. Power BI, if I want to do reporting, and then Microsoft Copilot Studio as well, if you want to add some intelligence inside of there. All right, so time for some tips and tricks, and then we'll kind of wrap it up.
Perfect. Yeah. And so, like you said, Jared, we'll talk about some tips and tricks, and then also we'll just mention a couple of successful scenarios that we've had too.
Perfect.
All right, awesome. So I know the Friday is one of your favorite things. You want to give that to them as one of our favorite scenarios we've seen?
Sure, I'll try to keep it short for the interest of time. So we had a client that was sending out, they send out a newsletter every week. Let's just say it's on Friday. And they have actually two groups of people they need to send it out to. So they had to send out two different newsletters. So they're very similar, but they have to go to specifically different sets of people. And so the work ethic or the process to get all that information together, then make sure it's 100% perfect, then actually release it was a pretty big process that they had going on in the background because it's a lot of very important information and the people rely on these newsletters. We took that, moved it over into a SharePoint process, and now it's a SharePoint site. They use SharePoint pages to be able to create what would have been in the newsletter. They have permissioning inside of there. So when you come to that site, you only see the ones you should see. Whether you're in group A, you see the group A stuff. If you're in group B, you see the group B stuff. So all that was something that SharePoint did for them. But then we needed to automate the process of actually sending those out because there is a button that you could click, hey, let me just go ahead and publish this, but we didn't want that. And then SharePoint sites also have the ability to do publishing built into them, but we didn't want that either because it skipped some of their actual steps. So we automated that whole process so that it has to have approval from certain people before it can go out. It has to be the right date before it can be sent out. It has to, we have to make sure that it's 100% secure before it moves out. So there's a lot of steps that it checks in the background for them to make sure it's absolutely going to happen 100% correctly each time. And so building that into a workflow, what they reported back to us is that greatly improved their process and that all the end users were happy about it. So nothing ever went out early, nothing ever went out on a mistake. And even if something did get released and they needed to make an alteration to it, they didn't have to send it out again. They could just make a change to the page. So just really, really cool things that brought to them.
All right, perfect. And we've seen some other great scenarios as well. I won't go into them again for sake of time, but think about things like project sites and creating automatically a space in SharePoint to host project documents and lock that down to just the team that's working on that project. Or again, onboarding, one of our more common systems that we help out with. And even things like user and license management, we've been able to automate with these tools.
Yep.
All right, so we'll leave you off with just a few tips on building good workflows and successfully governing the Power Platform, because we think this is important. So you've seen several of these tips for building clean and efficient workflows in our demos that we had for you today. First, renaming actions. I think that any of you who go out there and build Power Automate workflows, you should rename all of your actions. There's almost never a case where the default name is better than one that's a little bit more descriptive. Right? I mentioned how we had that AI action that was just called analyze positive or negative sentiment in text. Well, what text is it analyzing? I want to be able to tell at a glance without having to dig into the workflow and actually figure out what it's doing. So renaming that to in ticket description or in inspection description does a much better job for people who come through and need to look at my workflow to figure out where something went wrong or where they need to make a change. You also saw that I added notes to some of my actions in that last workflow. Again, just building onto that description, helping people who come and see the workflow really understand what's going on. I think notes are something that not enough Power Platform makers actually leverage to help self-document their workflows. But that's important, right? We want your workflows to be something that you can understand for years to come, and something that if, say, IT needs to help you with the workflow, they can understand it at a glance without having to really dig into and try to figure out how things are put together. We also talked about terminate and get changes, but there's one more control that I want to point out about really limiting your flow runs to just the runs you think should be happening, and that's called trigger conditions. Essentially, the point of terminate, get changes, trigger conditions, all those pieces of logic is to really just help you start to limit your workflow, right? Like we talked about, you probably don't want your workflow to run every single time an item gets edited or every single time someone adds a new line to a document. You're probably looking for something a little bit more specific. So having some control over whether that workflow ends early, if conditions weren't met, whether that workflow ever triggers at all if conditions weren't met, that's going to be powerful stuff to help keep your workflows running only when you'd really expect them to. And last for this slide, concurrency control. So this is maybe more of a topic that developers might be interested in. But if you've heard of things like parallel processing, being able to evaluate and work off of multiple items at once, well, we can do that in our workflows. So actions like get items or get files can pull back multiple results. If we need to loop over those and do something for each of those results, the workflow does that one at a time by default. That's pretty slow, right? If I have 5,000 plus items I'm looping over, doing those one at a time could take forever. I would much rather have my workflow set up so that I could run 50 of those items at a time. And that way it'll complete just that little bit faster and help your workflow stay as efficient as possible. All right. Anything you wanted to add to this slide?
Nope, that's just awesome.
Perfect. And my final tips for you kind of relate back to workflow governance. So I mentioned that I think templates is an important thing to get into, and that's true. As an IT team or as an organization, I think you should set up your users with some templates that can do things like error handling just by default. Your users might not know how to put some of that together, but that's important stuff to help make sure that your workflows are really running well and that if anything goes wrong, we're aware of it and can get out ahead of it. So definitely consider using some error handling templates that you can let people start their own workflows from. And then last but certainly not least, share critical workflows with IT. For that matter, don't even run those connections under the context of a user. Maybe run them as a service account. That way, if Tavon ever wins the lottery and retires, those workflows that I built can still keep running even long after my account gets disabled.
So I think that's super important as a part of governance, to make sure that we have those running as service accounts and not under the user's context. Because as we say, people win the lottery, they move on to different positions, things like that. Or if they reset their password, it just messes up a flow. And if that flow is mission critical because you built it to be mission critical, then that becomes a problem. So definitely some good governance around there. Include that in your governance effort. But even if you don't have a governance effort, make sure you put some rules around who can do workflows and how they should be created. Awesome.
All right.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that we'll ask. Again, I know we're past time, so feel free to stay through these couple of questions. If you aren't, then you'll still get the answers to them and hear what the questions were in the recordings later. So someone asked, can multiple triggers be used to run the same flow?
That is a great question. I wish we could have multiple triggers on one flow. I really do. But unfortunately, no. It's one trigger per workflow, and that trigger is usually very, very specific. Like with those SharePoint triggers, you saw that we had to point it at a specific site, at a specific library, or a specific list, right? Or those recurring triggers, if I want it to run daily, it's only going to understand that it should be running daily. It's not going to also be able to do other types of recurrence in that same flow.
So we basically had to have, you have that flow for that trigger, you create another flow for a different trigger. And if it's perhaps everything runs the same except for what the trigger is, you could at least duplicate that flow possibly, but there is no way to do what you're asking though.
Awesome. Okay, another one we had was, do we have to have a certain license to be able to use Power Automate?
So broadly speaking, no. It is kind of just included in whatever your regular licenses are. However, there are premium actions and premium connectors that do incur a bit of an extra cost. There's a couple of different ways that you can license those premium flows so that you can pay for them the cheapest way possible. But of course, you'll have to decide what kind of premium licensing you want to get. Is it per user? Is it per flow, per app? And Microsoft has a lot of documentation out there to try and help clear up that whole puzzle.
And then also maybe remember that there are some companies that you might use their connector, but you also need a license to work with their app on the other end of that as well. So keep that in mind.
Perfect. And then, so we don't go too far over, we'll answer one more question. I've got, can you explain the difference between a desktop flow and a cloud flow?
All right. So cloud flows, it's really all in the name, right? So cloud flows truly do just run in the cloud. They run off of good old-fashioned Microsoft servers. You don't have to be involved in those workflows actually being run. You don't have to have a machine up for them to run. It's not going to touch your desktop or any local files unless you have kind of a way for it to do that with a connector to do so. Desktop flows, on the other hand, actually do run against a real machine that you have some control over. So we can run a desktop flow, for example, against my laptop here, and it can interact with things like my local files, or even do some things that cloud flows just don't have the power to, like I believe regular expressions are supported in desktop, but not in cloud flows.
And I would say that, a usage for a desktop flow might be I have a repetitive task. Like I open up an Excel document, I click on this tab, and then I highlight these three rows, and then I copy them, and then I create another worksheet, and then I paste them in that worksheet, and then it does some calculation on it, something like that, right? So if that's the process you use every single time, well, you could map out a desktop flow to actually do all of that for you.
Okay, perfect. I think that's all the questions we had. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Again, you'll get the recording to the webinar and the slides as well. And if there's anything else that you have questions on, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.